we've named a bunch of titles, but have I ever played in a game where I really felt moved by this? And I'm coming up pretty short. Sean?
I have two examples. I won't go into the first one too deeply, but it was a complete disaster. But it was using second edition D&D, and I tried to have the battle going on at the same time, and it was just the players hated it, and I hated it, and
Were you
it's
using
because
rules for battles or just context?
um, I was head hockey. Basically, it said, "Okay, let's do this kind of thing." I was not using the battle system book at all.
Right.
I was just like, okay, every round something's going to happen in the battle, and you can choose to either make an attack on a person. You can chop a goblin or whatever, or you could do something that affected the battle, and it was just too confusing for everybody. But we did manage. I was not DMing. We did manage to have what you might want to call like a small scale battle in RuneQuest,
Right.
second classic. We were battling over, ironically, with the Lunars on our side, battling over a.
I have no problem with Lunars on our side.
I know you don't. I know, but anyone listening to this was probably like, Lunars, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
But I proudly play Lunar characters. But we did. We managed to basically, I guess, is much more like a mafia fight or something you'd find in the Dark Ages, 30 on 30.
Right. That's kind of the circle of hands situation. It's almost a gang fight more than anything else. Yeah.
And the way the GM handled it was simply how a particular round went for us in general. He sort of decided, like, if we all did really well against the other big enemies, then the tide turned in our favor.
Right.
If, however, we missed every single attack roll and someone lost an arm or we were down hit points, whatever, the tide was shifting against us. So
basically, it's sort of whatever you do is kind of a visual or prompt for how the battle's going to go. And although we know that makes no sense, it's frequently what's done in fiction. Frequently, even though it makes no real difference whether these particular characters, and I'm not talking about them having some special mission that plays some key role. I'm talking about whether they're just in the thick of it with everybody else. But in fictional terms, in the enjoyment of them as the main characters, their particular triumph, turns out to kind of mirror the fact that the battle is won on their side. And that, as I say, it's a very satisfying fictional device, and so there's no reason why we don't see it in role playing. I mean, it works. So okay, so it can be done. We know it can be done. I remember when we were playing Legendary Lives, the question is just how well did we feel it, if that makes any sense? Because, as I recall, unlike the assumption in Legendary Lives, none of our characters were playing that crucial leadership role, right? Because it's in Legendary Lives, you're kind of playing, it's about, well, what if you're the commander or somebody very consequential that other people are listening to during the battle. So the question is, basically, how well do you direct your side of the battle to combat how well they direct their side of the battle? Robbie, am I remembering this right? Pretty sure the rules work like that.
Yeah, my memory a little fuzzy, but I that sounds really.
Yeah, so so that's really direct. But the trouble was, as I say, is that it was a non-player character who was in that position, and Ross was in the difficult situation because in that game, the game master doesn't roll. All the rolls are player-driven, with the assumption being that the characters are opposing you or attacking you or doing something like that. What if a non-player character is doing something and you might conceivably aid what they're doing, but you're not doing it. The reverse is really easy. You still, I mean, if a non-player character is doing something that's helping you, it's always generated in terms of shifting your results. You still roll whatever it is you're doing, but you shift your results based on how good they are. And so it's really, really easy in most circumstances. But this one was tough. I remember Ross kind of flipping back and forth through the pages, cursing because it fell right into this hole between we have a system for battles and non-player characters don't roll. So, you know, I remember him sort of struggling with that. Now, here's sort of the well, before I go on with I'm just kind of free associating at the moment. I have ideas. Anyone else have thoughts on this, or what you would want out of a situation that you are in play, given the game? I mean, we had nothing for this in RuneQuest, right, Helma? I mean, there's nothing in there for this. And we were in a battle a couple of times.
I'm not 100% sure. I never read all of the rulebook, but I don't remember there was anything that we had.
We certainly didn't do
like
it. Yeah.
Rules-wise, we certainly didn't do it. What I was thinking at one point was how it would develop if you don't have this black and white. If the two sides aren't easily identified
Right.
as good or bad, and you are caught in between, you happen to be on one side or the other, depending on what you did before, and then you just have to live with it. So, and I have thought about that since then, but maybe that's something that only interests me.
It is an interesting point, because if you're in it, again, we're talking about we would have to be talking about a system in which your participation actually affects the tide of battle. So how would an ambiguous relationship to those sides operate? What if you wanted to, if you were in the middle of the battle, you did want to take action, but that action didn't really, if the action doesn't really affect the tide of battle, or you don't, your ideological role in the story doesn't symbolize one side or the other, then there would have to be some way for your character to get things done in the battle as some kind of hazardous environment, right? I mean, that's the only way I can think of. The situation with Sorcerer, if anyone's interested in that, is, I think, kind of an interesting one, in that a little bit like, okay, in Sorcerer you have scores which are very personal. They're your body, and they are your willpower, and they're your sorceress insights, and they're very personal. But you also have one more score, which is basically a social identity, and it's used for any actions. It's basically a whole skill list in a bag, right, for this character. So if you have something like, corrupt cop as this score, anything that seems relevant to what a corrupt cop would want to do, or habitually does, is handled by that score. And sometimes those things are large scale. It's perfectly okay to be, the governor, or even the head of state, as for that score in Sorcerer. Nothing stops you. You could say, well, I want my character to be the president. And it's like, okay, cool, you're playing the president. He's a sorcerer. Awesome. That's what we're playing. In which case, the idea that your character could indeed be in some situation where they could, with a wave of their hand, unleash amazing amounts of, logistic consequence. Well, that's the thing. In Sorcerer, it's pretty easy. Look around and say what of equivalent, scale of operation is interested in opposing this. And is the thing that's being done intrinsically opposing it? And I don't really like using the word difficulty for it. I just like to think of it as the perversity of non-human things that gets in the way. So if you, and functionally opposes you, even though it doesn't have any volition. So that's easy. Those things get scores. And there are even, not the best articulated, but there are ways in Sorcerer to arrive at that amount of dice. And so you're just basically up against an opposition. So unlike Trollbabe, where the whole character can operate at scales, different scales, in Sorcerer, if your score in question, which is called a cover, if it operates at a larger scale, well, then it operates at that scale and it can be opposed at that scale. And so the question of how to blend it seamlessly with everyone else's actions, it's actually fairly easy. You could actually have the order of action rules actually operate, and then whatever happens, I mean, if let's say my character is the commander of a force and the other characters are members of that force, just to keep things kind of easy in our discussion. And then there is an opposing commander, and then let's say there's a couple of non-player characters who are a lot like our characters, also on the other side. So far, so good. The simplistic but fairly reasonable way to do it is simply to conduct actions as usual and have them occur in the order that you want as usual. I mean, not the order that you want, but the order as determined by the rolls as usual. But the large-scale rolls are going to affect everybody on the opposite side. So if it's technically an attack roll, well, then they'll all take the damage. Thank you very much. Because the consequence of that order led to that whole side getting strafed by, flying machines or something. Does that make any sense, Robbie and Rod?
And I think, Rod handled the situation what along those lines. And Rod is Rod, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm here.
I don't know if you want to kind of talk about the situation. I thought the way it was handled yesterday worked quite well. I mean, my character in the game is not really ultimately equipped to be kind of taking on a commander role, but I think the way it was handled, it definitely put my character in action once they saw how they got a sense of how the larger conflict was going.
Right.
Did kind of my character kind of moving in a direction that wouldn't necessarily have taken at
Right.
on another direction.
How did you do it, Rod?
Well, so I don't know what you talked about already, Robbie, at the beginning, but this particular time, so I was kind of working this out. What I decided in this particular instance is the battle hasn't actually happened yet. I decided to give them both past rolls because it was relevant to sort of assess the situation. And basically, they both ended up succeeding and both ended up with sort of the foreknowledge that, the one side, the Crusaders are going to win the battle. That's the default expectation.
Okay, so you basically rolled for the whole thing as a blanket context. Okay.
Yeah, or more accurately in this particular case, I just decided based on the distribution of what was happening, and then gave them the roles to position their awareness of what was happening. And so that was the last thing we did in the game, I think. And then we started talking about why I was doing that and what we were doing differently. Now the session previous, or the adventure previously, story previously, whatever, I had run a battle where I did roles for the two different sides, and they sort of fought each other and gave each other penalties and so on. And so just circumstantially, it seemed a little. Well, I think what I should have done was just it's hard to say because the online medium isn't necessarily kind to sorcerer
Right.
because you've got these little piles of dice and no one can see what you're doing.
Yeah.
But in that particular case, the sequential rolls on multiple actions to determine the course of battle were sort of felt like a foregone conclusion once one side impacted the other side pretty highly at the
Right.
very beginning.
Right.
So in retrospect, it might have been, and the situation was not complex. It was just, we're lined up here, they're lined up there, we're running into each other. Arguably, in that case, just making one roll for the course of the battle and then, positioning the players running back and forth in it, but we sort of know what the outcome is,
Right.
would have been fine and possibly better for the circumstances.